Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a story you probably only think you know. Drawing straight from the incredible, deeply researched details in Philip Norman's biography, Shout, we aren't just going to look at how a famous pop group got together. No, we're going to examine the intense, psychological pressure cooker that forged John Lennon and Paul McCartney. We're going to see how their wildly different personalities and personal struggles created a dynamic that could either build something unimaginably powerful or just completely tear them apart.
Okay, let's jump right into the fundamental tension here because it is the absolute core of our narrative today. Before all the global screaming, before the matching suits, you had two young men acting as perfectly opposed psychological forces. Really think about this. What happens when raw, volatile chaos collides head-on with calculated, disciplined ambition? Well, to understand that, we first have to understand the completely unique world that built them.
The backdrop of our story is absolutely vital. The 1950s teenager wasn't just an age group like it is today. It was this newly emerged, heavily scrutinized societal class, and Liverpool was basically ground zero. Because it was a seaport, local sailors, who were known as the Canard Yanks, were constantly returning from New York, smuggling back these obscure Chuck Berry and rhythm and blues records. So you have this vibrant, imported American sound violently colliding with gray, post-war British austerity. It sparked a cultural heatwave that totally defined this restless new youth class.
Which brings us to Section 1, Chaos and the Teddy Point.
To really grasp the spark of this whole thing, we have to start with a boy whose internal life was just a complete storm of abandonment and rebellion. John Lennon's early life was a massive contradiction. He was abandoned by his father at age 6, and then his mother, Julia, actually handed him over to be raised by his super strict Aunt Mitty. So he grew up in this surprisingly comfortable, highly structured middle-class home called Mendips. I mean, this house was so proper it literally had a morning room and servants' bells. But that cozy outward environment clashed violently with his inner emotional turmoil. He rebelled deeply, adopting the defiant working-class teddy boy look, complete with drainpipe trousers, to the absolute horror of his aunt.
And the crucial takeaway here is that John's defiance wasn't just your run-of-the-mill teenage angst. It was a laser-focused attack on authority. His headmaster considered him the absolute worst delinquent in the entire school. But John's rebellion was also against the very people trying to raise him. Aunt Mimi famously tried to wave off his musical obsession, telling him, "The guitar's all very well, John, but you'll never make a living out of it." He literally stood in her glass porch practicing for so long that she claimed he wore away the brickwork with his behind.
And this inner chaos just bled right into how he ran his early skiffle group, the Quarry Men. He led them with an iron, completely unpredictable fist. To give you a sense of the volatile energy we're talking about, during a party, John actually took a washboard and smashed it right over his bandmate Pete Shotton's head. Just for laughs. Shotton just sat there, framed by the broken wood, crying with laughter. John commanded the room through total chaos.
Moving on to Section 2, Order, Ambition, and Charm.
So, if John was pure chaos, who was order? Let's pan across the city and look at how a completely opposing personality gets built. Paul's world was practically the inverse of John's. Raised in a working-class council house on Forthland Road, Paul was taught charm, politeness, and strict musical rules by his father Jim, who was a former jazz band leader. At school, Paul was the cooperative kid in the neat little blazer, permanently head boy in his grade. But this incredibly structured world was shattered by the sudden, tragic death of his mother, Mary, when Paul was just 14. It was a trauma that instantly, brutally forced him to grow up.
What are we going to do without her money? Those were the very first words a 14-year-old Paul blurted out in the utter shock of his mother's loss. It brilliantly and almost jarringly illustrates the pragmatic, fiercely focused ambition that this tragedy permanently installed in Paul's psyche. While John reacted to his abandonment with explosive rebellion, Paul reacted to profound loss by desperately clinging to control, charm, and cold, hard survival.
Now let's look at Section 3, a collision of opposites.
So what happens when these two highly reactive elements finally cross paths? Because they were absolute polar opposites. John was instinctive, provocative, and fully embraced raw chaos. Paul, on the other hand, was technically precise, incredibly PR-conscious, and actively sought out adult approval. I mean, when Paul was invited into the group, he didn't just come in and play guitar. He instantly started complaining about the band's pay distribution, arguing that their manager shouldn't get an equal cut if he wasn't up there playing on stage.
Their famous first meeting went down on July 6, 1957, at the Woolton Fete, and let me tell you, it wasn't some wholesome magical meeting of the minds. It was a very tense sizing up. John had spent that entire morning having a furious screaming match with his Aunt Mimi over his teddy boy clothes, and he performed his set in a gaseous mist of illicit light ales. Paul, meanwhile, showed up completely composed, highly calculating, and armed with undeniable technical talent. Which left John with a massive dilemma. Why risk your absolute leadership by inviting a highly competent rival into your inner circle? John hesitated. He knew admitting Paul severely threatened his total control over the band, but in a moment of sheer artistic instinct, John chose to build a stronger group over protecting his own ego. He invited the threat inside. And the result of that huge decision? Pure combustion. They began furiously writing songs, though not really as collaborators at first. Actually, scratch that. It was more like rivals pushing each other in a deeply competitive race. Paul would write a song just to prove himself. John, spurred by Paul and his own idol Buddy Holly, would immediately scramble to write one back. That underlying gritty friction would end up defining their entire partnership.
Let's move to Section 4, Forging the Pressure Cooker.
As their individual identities, as songwriters really started to lock in, their external environment began to rapidly change. Notice how, as they evolve, their world systematically shrinks, literally sealing these volatile teenagers inside a pressure cooker. They went from playing open-air flatbed trucks at the Woolden Fete to being crammed into claustrophobic, seedy dive bars in Hamburg. Then they came back to Liverpool to play the Cavern Club, a damp, totally unventilated underground cellar. And finally, they were literally stuffed into identical, restrictive tailored suits by their new manager.
That manager, Brian Epstein, placed them in what the source material describes as a protective bubble. Now sure, this gave these traumatized young men unprecedented financial and physical security, but simultaneously, it completely isolated them. They were kept in an anesthetizing, blinding bubble, totally cut off from the mechanics of their own success. It essentially locked John's chaos and Paul's ambition in a tiny, airtight room together.
And how did society react to this massively confined, hyper-focused energy being unleashed? With a dangerous, feral hysteria unlike anything Britain had ever witnessed. When that bubble finally hit the public, the screaming was literally deafening. Girls were hunching into fetal positions. After their shows, cinema seats were wringing wet, and there were literal puddles of urine left on the floor. It was this massive, frenzied release of absolute tension.
But even as Britain completely collapsed into this hysteria, a massive shadow hung right over them. They've got everything over there, they thought. What do they want us for? America wasn't just going to be another tour. It was the ultimate looming test of their incredibly fragile, volatile alliance.
You see, everything we've looked at today, the intense childhood trauma, John's explosive rebellion, Paul's cold discipline, the bitter internal rivalry, and the claustrophobic physical confinement, it was all merely preparation. They were not just forming a band. They were developing complex identities in a psychological crucible, preparing for an unimaginably vast global stage.
Which leaves us right on the precipice. We have two fundamentally opposed psychological forces locked tightly in a shrinking bubble, heading straight toward the biggest cultural stage in human history. With the pressure gauge deep in the red, we're left to wonder, how did this volatile powder keg survive its own internal forces before it finally exploded onto the world? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the stories you think you know, and I'll catch you next time.